What I really thought was that changing the world was a matter of getting the right evidence to the right policymakers, and then change would naturally follow. I don't think that anymore. And I guess if I had to pick out a moment of epiphany where I really got this properly, this was the final meeting of the UN's high-level panel on global sustainability. I had felt for years that a panel like this would give policymakers a chance to step back from all the day-to-day firefighting and really think about the hardest dilemmas involved in managing an interdependent world. More fool me, as it turned out, because what I actually saw that day at UN headquarters was a perfect illustration of what's been called the G0, a world in which no leaders are prepared to think beyond their national interests or show vision on the toughest global issues. And amid all the disillusionment, I lost my conviction that rational arguments backed up by hard evidence would be enough to persuade politicians of the need for radical change to build the fairer, more sustainable world that I wanted, which left me wondering, if evidence and arguments aren't enough, then what is? Suddenly, all the issues I've been writing about for so long, refugees, droughts, food crises, were staring me right in the face, not as pie charts, but as real-life stories of real people facing real hardship. And I thought about that question again from thousands of miles away as Donald Trump secured the Republican nomination and as the Brexit campaign triumphed. In both cases, not because of facts or evidence or data, but because the resonance of the stories that they told. Stories about making America great again. Stories of taking back control. Stories that played expertly on fears of a shadowy other and on building walls to keep them out. Stories I started to realize had a raw power that pie charts and pamphlets never would. And as I watched the dramas of 2016 play out, I also had a strange sense of déjà vu, because the Trump and the Brexit victories were all too similar to what I'd seen happen on climate change back in 2009. Back then, climate activists were technocrats, insiders, data-rich, evidence-based. And until 2009, it looked as though this approach was working. Climate activists learned their lesson. They got smart. They realized that if they wanted to beat the Tea Party at its own game, then they needed to look far beyond policymakers and pie charts. How did the climate activists do it? In large part, through stopping being policy wonks and reinventing themselves as storytellers, as myth makers. Not so long ago, our society was rich in stories. Stories that helped us to understand the world and ourselves. Stories that gave us meaning and identity and purpose. We call these stories myths. And along the way, we've lost those old stories that used to help us make sense of the world, but without replacing them with new ones. Instead, we have what I call a myth gap, a phrase I borrowed from the writer Jonas Sachs. It's a kind of a flatland of culture wars and social media echo chambers, entertainment, distraction, and ever shorter attention spans. So what, you might ask, does all this have to do with politics, economics, and how we shape the future of our societies? Well, I think the answer is everything. Without shared myths to bind societies together, the risks increase dramatically of fragmentation, polarization, and conflict, just as we see all around us today. There's real danger here. If the stories that we reach for in conditions of turbulence and crisis and uncertainty are stories about overshoot and collapse, and we all start to act accordingly, competing rather than cooperating, fragmenting rather than coming together, then those stories can all too easily become self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is really, I think, the most important point about myths. They create our reality as much as they describe it. As the novelist Terry Pratchett once put it, people think that stories are shaped by people. Actually, it's the other way around. And yet still, far too often, political progressives try and fight these hugely resonant stories with policy memos, as if rational arguments and empirical data will somehow win out against brilliant political narratives of the little guy versus remote elites, or corrupt politicians only out to line their own pockets. That was the mistake made by climate campaigners back in 2009. It was the same mistake that the Remain campaign made during the Brexit referendum here in the UK. And it was the mistake that paved the way for Trump to win the US presidency. All of which makes me wonder, what if rather than spending all our time fact-checking Donald Trump's tweets or bemoaning the perfidy of the Brexiteers' infamous claim that EU membership costs Britain £350 million a week. What if progressives became storytellers of the right kinds of myths? Myths that unite us rather than dividing us. Now, the anti-myths of Farage and Trump and Le Pen explicitly set out to oppose that. So we need to take them on with stories about what can happen and what we can create together if and when we do take that final step to a genuinely global us. I think the second thing we need is myths that shift how we see our place in time, situating ourselves in a longer now that stands midway between a deep past and an equally deep future. And third, we need myths that help us aspire to a different good life, one in which growth is less about how much we consume and more about finally growing up as a species. Because I think many of us feel at some intuitive level that we've been living through humanity's adolescence, reckless, rebellious, focused on instant gratification, testing the limits. And now we're alive at just the moment at which our species is on the very cusp of maturity. Not just recognizing our responsibilities or the consequences of our actions, but actually finding a sense of meaning and identity and purpose about what it is we're here on Earth to do. A larger us, a longer now, and a different good life. None of these are new ideas. All of them recur over and over again in the history of our myths for thousands of years now. But today, we risk forgetting them because we don't have the stories that embody them. So we need to get them back, and fast.